Have you ever wondered why the very qualities that make you unique, that make you radiant, seem to draw both admiration and hostility in equal measure? Carl Jung uncovered a cruel truth hidden deep within human psychology. For people with heightened sensitivity and empathic abilities, their greatest gift often becomes the root of their deepest suffering. He saw that empaths live in a paradox, carrying within them a light so luminous that it not only heals others but also exposes what most people spend their lives trying to bury. It is not simply kindness that draws others to them. It is their raw, unfiltered authenticity, the way they still feel, still connect, still remain alive in a world that has chosen numbness as its survival strategy. Yet this very aliveness is what provokes resentment. To those who have cut themselves off from their own emotional depth, the empath becomes a living reminder of what they once had but abandoned. Jung discovered that empaths unconsciously attract people who are carrying vast amounts of repressed pain, people who cannot bear their own shadow, and so they project it outward onto the one who dares to embody what they themselves have lost. Jung noticed that the more radiant and authentic a sensitive person becomes, the more threatening they appear to others. Their presence destabilizes carefully constructed psychological defenses. The empath's openness becomes unbearable for someone who has spent decades suppressing vulnerability. Their capacity to feel deeply reveals the truth of another's emotional deadness. This is why empaths are both loved and hated at the same time, sought out for their warmth, their ability to understand, their rare light, and yet secretly despised for the exact same qualities. Jung called this dynamic shadow projection, and it explained why empaths often end up confused, exhausted, and wondering why their generosity seems to invite both devotion and betrayal. The empath doesn't provoke this hostility by doing anything wrong. They provoke it simply by existing as themselves. Their very presence confronts others with the parts of themselves they would rather never face. From his clinical work, Jung began documenting a repeating and disturbing pattern. People with extraordinary empathic gifts seemed to magnetize relationships that began with overwhelming closeness and ended with inexplicable hostility. At first, people were drawn to them like moths to a flame, confessing secrets they had never shared before, feeling understood in ways they had never experienced, sometimes even describing the relationship as life-changing. The empath, by simply being themselves, created a kind of sanctuary where emotional walls could drop and authentic connection could emerge. Yet inevitably, the same people who once clung to them for comfort would begin to turn against them. Subtle criticisms would appear, then sharper judgments, until the relationship collapsed under the weight of resentment. The empath was left bewildered, asking why someone who once seemed so grateful for their presence had suddenly become cold, hostile, or even cruel. Jung realized he was not observing ordinary relational dysfunction. He was witnessing the mechanics of the shadow in action. When unconscious people encounter someone who has preserved connection to their authentic feeling function, they cannot help but be unsettled. Authentic emotional expression acts like a mirror. It reflects back the parts of themselves they have abandoned, the vulnerability they have disowned, the aliveness they have traded for acceptance. This reflection is painful. It stirs shame. And because they cannot admit to themselves that the shame originates within, they redirect it outward toward the empath. The result is a cycle in which empaths are both desperately needed and viciously attacked, praised for qualities that others simultaneously resent, and punished for being what others secretly wish they could still be. Jung called this cruel pattern the paradox of the empath, and it remains one of his most disturbing discoveries. He saw that empaths do not merely help others heal, they unintentionally force others to confront the truth of their own inner death. That confrontation can lead to transformation, but more often it leads to hostility. Sensitive individuals live at the crossroads of this paradox. They either collapse under the weight of constant projection and criticism, or they rise, strengthened and transformed, into what Jung believed humanity most desperately needs: emotional pioneers capable of leading others back to their buried authenticity. Jung observed that what most empaths fail to recognize is that the hostility they receive is rarely personal. It is not their kindness, nor their mistakes, nor even their choices that trigger rejection. It is the mirror they hold up without realizing it. When you walk through life with your sensitivity intact, you do something that many people find unbearable. You remind them of what they have buried in themselves. Your depth stirs their shallowness. Your honesty exposes their pretenses. Your refusal to shut down shines a light on the parts of themselves they have locked away in the basement of their psyche. Jung described this as shadow confrontation, and he insisted that most people are not ready for it. They will fight to the death to protect their illusions rather than face the raw pain of their own suppressed truths. And so the empath is cast into the role of the villain, not because they have done wrong, but because they dared to exist as a living contradiction to the lies others depend on. This is why relationships with empaths often follow such a haunting pattern. At first, they are adored, praised, even idealized. They are told they are different, that they are special, that they are a gift in a cold and indifferent world. But this pedestal is never stable. As soon as the mirror turns too sharp, as soon as the depth becomes too confronting, the love turns to irritation, then resentment, and finally to rejection. Jung wrote that this cycle is inevitable unless the other person has begun their own work of shadow integration. Without that inner work, the empath becomes too much to handle, too intense, too reflective of truths that the other cannot tolerate. And yet, paradoxically, many of these same individuals find themselves unable to fully let go of the empath, because walking away from them is also walking away from the last living connection to their buried humanity. This is the tormenting paradox. To need and despise the same person at once, to cling to the one who makes you feel alive and simultaneously resent them for exposing your wounds. For the empath, the danger lies in misunderstanding this dynamic. Too often, they internalize the hostility they face. They assume they are at fault, that they gave too much or not enough, that they failed to love correctly or heal perfectly. Jung warned against this self-blame, for it is the very trap that keeps empaths enslaved to cycles of exploitation and betrayal. The truth is harsher and yet liberating. Nothing they could do would prevent the projection from occurring. It is not about them, but about the unhealed pain in others. The hostility they face is not proof of their inadequacy, it is proof of their impact. They have disturbed the silence that others tried so desperately to maintain. And that disturbance, though painful, is also the only doorway through which transformation can ever begin. But Jung went further, insisting that there is an even deeper truth. He suggested that empaths themselves are not free from shadow work. Their sensitivity, while extraordinary, is also a double-edged sword. Too often, they use their gift as a form of avoidance. By endlessly focusing on others, by carrying pain that does not belong to them, they can distract themselves from their own unresolved wounds. In this way, their gift becomes a mask, a shield from facing their own shadows. Jung warned that unless the empath learns to turn their gaze inward, to confront the darkness within themselves, they will forever remain trapped in cycles of self-sacrifice and disappointment. It is not enough to see the pain of others. They must also learn to face their own. Only then does their gift transform from a burden into a power. When an empath begins this inner work, something extraordinary happens. The same qualities that once drew hostility now begin to command respect. The same vulnerability that once felt like a curse begins to radiate as strength. By integrating their own shadow, they break free from the need to constantly rescue, to constantly prove their worth through sacrifice. They no longer tolerate endless cycles of exploitation because they see clearly that their role is not to carry the weight of everyone else's wounds. Instead, they stand as a reminder, a presence, a beacon. They no longer allow themselves to be drained because they have realized the truth Jung emphasized again and again. You cannot save someone from a shadow they refuse to face. All you can do is embody your own wholeness and let that wholeness call forth what is buried in others. It is at this point that the empath undergoes their most radical transformation. They evolve from the wounded healer, endlessly pouring themselves out for those who resent them, into the awakened guide, someone who walks with clarity and boundaries. They are no longer destroyed by rejection because they understand its origin. They are no longer seduced by flattery because they know how quickly it can turn to resentment. They no longer confuse hostility for failure because they see it for what it truly is, the shadow fighting to remain hidden. In this way, the empath steps into their full power, not by abandoning their sensitivity, but by integrating it with wisdom and strength. There comes a moment in every empath's life when they finally see the repeating pattern for what it is: not an accident, not bad luck, not a punishment from fate, but a mirror held up to their own inner reality. They begin to understand that the constant cycle of being drained, betrayed, or rejected was never just about the cruelty of others. It was also about their own unconscious willingness to remain in roles that demanded endless sacrifice. Jung warned that until a person becomes conscious of their shadow, it will rule their life, and they will call it destiny. For the empath, this means that the suffering they attract is not random. It is the externalization of their own disowned shadow, a relentless teacher forcing them to confront the part of themselves they would rather avoid: the part that fears being selfish, the part that fears disappointing others, the part that clings to worth only through being needed. This is where the transformation begins, when they stop asking, "Why does this always happen to me?" and begin to ask, "What in me requires this lesson again and again?" The realization is shattering at first. It feels like a betrayal of everything they believed about themselves, because the empath often prides themselves on purity, kindness, and selflessness. To suggest that their own unconscious choices invite mistreatment seems cruel, even offensive. Yet Jung insisted that true healing is never comfortable. The shadow will always disguise itself as virtue. The empath's giving nature, their compassion, their boundless patience, all of these can mask a hidden fear of abandonment, a hidden terror of being unworthy without usefulness. And so, unconsciously, they choose partners, friends, and family dynamics that exploit them, because these situations reinforce the very script their shadow demands: that their worth comes only through suffering and self-denial. The awakening begins when the empath dares to break this script, when they stop performing the role of silent martyr and begin to embrace the radical truth that they are allowed to exist for themselves, not just for others. Once this shift occurs, the landscape of their life begins to change in ways that are both liberating and terrifying. People who once clung to them for constant emotional nourishment now recoil, angry that the endless supply has dried up. Relationships built on imbalance crumble. The empath feels waves of guilt at first, haunted by the old programming that whispers, "You are abandoning them. You are selfish." But as Jung wrote, individuation, the process of becoming whole, demands the courage to disappoint others. It requires breaking free from the tyranny of other people's expectations. Slowly, the empath begins to see that by holding boundaries, by refusing to carry what is not theirs, they are not being cruel, but truthful. They are no longer enabling the illusions of others. They are no longer acting as crutches for those who refuse to walk. This loss of false relationships, though painful, creates space for something new. Connections based not on need or exploitation, but on mutual respect and authenticity. And this is where the true power of the awakened empath reveals itself. For the first time, they are able to embody compassion without collapsing into self-destruction. They can give without losing themselves, listen without absorbing, love without erasing their own needs. Their presence becomes sharper, clearer, undeniable. They radiate not a fragile light that flickers with the moods of others, but a steady flame rooted in self-awareness. Jung often emphasized that the integration of shadow does not destroy one's essence, it strengthens it, refines it, and makes it unshakable. In this state, the empath no longer fears rejection, because they have learned that rejection is not death, it is redirection. They no longer fear being misunderstood, because they have realized that their task was never to be universally accepted but to live authentically. The hostility that once crushed them now rolls off their back, because they understand it as nothing more than projection. They see with piercing clarity that most people are not fighting them but fighting themselves. From this place of strength, the empath transforms into something rarely a living contradiction to the culture of numbness and denial. They no longer chase validation, but they naturally command it. They no longer beg to be seen, yet their presence cannot be ignored. They embody the paradox Jung so often described, the integration of light and shadow, the marriage of sensitivity and strength. People who once dismissed them as weak now sense something immovable in their energy, something that cannot be manipulated or diminished. They are not loud, not domineering, but their quiet confidence shakes others at their core. For those who are ready to face their own shadows, the empath becomes a catalyst for profound change, a reminder that vulnerability is not weakness, but power. For those who are not ready, their presence is unbearable, because it dismantles the lies they live within. This is the final turning point, where the empath's lifelong curse becomes their greatest gift. No longer enslaved by guilt, no longer trapped in cycles of sacrifice, they step fully into their role as an awakener. They understand now that their purpose was never to save everyone, but to embody wholeness so powerfully that it inspires others to seek their own. They see clearly that they were never meant to blend in, never meant to be universally accepted. Their destiny was always to disrupt, to stir, to reflect, to remind the world of what it has forgotten. In this way, the empath completes the journey Jung described, moving from unconscious victimhood to conscious sovereignty, from fragile mirror to unshakable presence. And in doing so, they discover the deepest truth of all that: the very pain that once nearly destroyed them was the fire that forged their strength, and that the very rejection they feared was the door that led them home to themselves.